Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Crossroads, and I'd like to welcome my two guests from Canada. Welcome, Robert Klinck.
Good to see you again, Arnie.
No worries,
It's always
pleased
a
to.
pleasure.
It is a pleasure. It's great having you here. Thank you, Robert. And Wallace Klinck. Welcome, Wallace.
Hi there, Arnie. I'm sad to inform you that tonight apparently it's going to go down to about one above. However, it's going to recover afterwards. But
Okay. We had a 25 on Saturday, Wallace. 25. It was just
yeah, that's a nice temperature.
And everybody was freezing, I'm sure.
25 above. I don't think so. 25 above. We've been having 15s, I think, yesterday, today, whatever, and a little bit of rain, but the 25 was beautiful. And of course, tomorrow morning, our time is spring. So the buds are bursting, the flowers are coming out on the trees, fruit is setting, all those sort of wonderful things, the procession of nature. It is really a wonderful time. It's a wonderful time. Okay, our subject for today, at least the title, The Administrative Era, Series 4. I want to actually do a little bit of a collage in regard to activist High Court judges. The first judge of interest is a bloke called Lionel Murphy. He was a senator for New South Wales between 1962 and 1975, and he was appointed as a High Court judge, the highest court in the land. And his decisions, the decisions that he was party to, but I would suggest he was almost like principal lead on. And in particular, this 1983 case, Commonwealth versus Tasmania, it's referred to as the Franklin Dam issue. And that's the actual finding, High Court of Australia. That's the written document. You can download it. I'll place links for you to look at. Now, the Tasmanian Dam, this is the Australian National University. It essentially changed the relationship between the Commonwealth and the states under a radical interpretation of the external affairs. External affairs, two words in the Constitution, and the High Court used that justification to change the relationship between the Commonwealth and the states. And just a little bit from the archives. This is just to highlight that the Wilderness Society, essentially a green movement at that time, although I think they were more interested in environment rather than communism, full blown, whereas now it's evolved into communism. But I would suggest that this High Court decision did more to bring about communism in Australia than other decisions. Now, Lionel Murphy was a man who was actually under investigation before his, if you'd like, demise and death, on lots of charges and lots of innuendo, lots of insinuations with shady people. And there is a Australian National University, there is actually a foundation that holds him in high esteem. Professor Manning Clark, another activist, but this time a historian, he wrote essentially a eulogy in regard to who he was. Now, the other judge of interest that I want to bring up is a bloke called Robin Millhouse. Robin Millhouse ended up becoming a Supreme Court judge in South Australia, but he was the Attorney General under a Liberal government, a Conservative government. As an Attorney General, he was responsible for the introduction of abortion laws in South Australia. And as a consequence of that introduction, that then flowed out to the rest of Australia. He says in about 2014 that he had deep regrets about that. This is a man who was Attorney General. He was also a Supreme Court judge, as if he could not see or look ahead to the ramifications of the decisions that he was personally responsible for instigating. Another point I just wanted to touch on is the history of referendum in Australia. And to date, I believe we've had 44 questions, of which only 8 have passed. And this is from the Australian Electoral Commission website. I'm going to place a link to that. I think it's important because it goes to show the student, the observer, that every time there's a referenda, there is an attempt to expand the powers of the Commonwealth over the states. And finally, just a quick hit and run on our front page of the Australian. The Melbourne lockdown can't end by the deadline, says the Chief Medical Officer, Nick Coatsworth. And of course, this artistic depiction here, caricature, is of the border, the hard border, guards, high fences, barbed wire in Queensland, not even letting emergency services through to take patients to the hospital. So that's where we are with the roundup of the news. And those two judges, the activist judges, who brought about, as I said, significant change. The links will show you that they were both, as Attorney Generals, brought about radical changes to the culture, to the way Australians thought and behaved. Lionel Murphy, infamous for his Family Law Act, and Robin Millhouse for the abortion laws that allowed legalised abortion up to a certain time of gestation in South Australia, which then flowed out to the States. These are important parts of our history and our consideration. We talked about politicians and the treachery of politicians. We talked about the media and the treachery or the brainwashing of the media to paint a false narrative. And of course, how important our Constitution is, a limiting document on government. And now if the people can't agree through referenda, we have activists, judges, in order to bring about significant reinterpretations of our Constitution. So our constitutions have been under attack since their very inception. The first referenda for the Commonwealth, 1910, I believe it was. 9 years after Federation, the attacks were already underway. So it goes to show you that the document itself has to be of such a robust nature, recognising that judges, lawyers, politicians and the media will do everything that they can in their power to actually deconstruct our constitutions. Your thoughts, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, you can make a constitution as robust as possible, but you're dealing with lawyers when you're discussing the decisions of Supreme Courts, and lawyers are very clever at distinguishing cases, and so they can come up with interpretations of things that are completely novel and very surprising, because you've assumed all along that the language of the Constitution was clear, and then these people can view it in such a way that it's not at all what you thought it was. You know, the Americans thought they had a very robust Constitution, and it did seem that way. Absolute guarantees on rights to bear arms, and freedom of speech, and no intrusion into your private domain without proper authorization and all this. But all that seems to be under threat right now. And if the Supreme Court in Canada, in the United States, I'm sure it's true in Australia too, has become a virtual ideological battleground. You would have thought that the Supreme Court is there to interpret the law that is proclaimed by the Governor General after being enacted by Parliament. But you can see from the fact that there is such competitive effort to capture a vacancy whenever it comes up on a Supreme Court by a person of your own ideological bent, that the idea that law is something completely impartial and subject to logical interpretation, it just doesn't seem to hold, and the Americans thought that they had a conservative judge when Roberts became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court there. But he has been on the anti-conservative side of virtually every judgment. And it's mystifying. But what happens if someone in that position actually comes under some sort of external control? It almost looks as if something like that is going on with Chief Justice Roberts, because he has not fulfilled the expectations that all the conservatives had for him. So these are, as I say, they're ideological battlegrounds now, and it's not what you would really expect to be the situation of a court that is supposed to be interpreting law. Yeah, the emphasis on ideological proclivities, their tendencies, just doesn't seem appropriate in that context. But we have seen the same thing in Canada. We have the two major parties, the Conservatives and the Liberals. And when a vacancy comes up for the Supreme Court, it's always a big issue whether the Liberals or Conservatives are in power at that time, because they're trying to get a justice who thinks similarly to them. Now, as it turns out, whether it's Liberal or Conservative, you seem to get the same kind of judge. They've all got progressive thinking. There was actually a genuine conservative who got on the Supreme Court a number of years ago, but he didn't survive very long in the actual physical sense. So it's I don't know how you overcome it. You have to have some kind of a system of appointment. The idea that the government in power can name somebody quite arbitrarily doesn't seem to work out very well. And there probably should be some kind of wider input into the decision of who will succeed a judge when one steps down.
Thank you for that, Robert. That's quite a profound observation. And it actually, the major thoughts that were coming to my mind in regard to this consideration, the anomaly, the discrepancy between what the people aspire for in a judge and what's actually outworked, and the fact that judges can be politically active. And that is the consideration of the veto power, or if you like, the recall power, recalling a politician or recalling anyone in public office. And that is the ability that if a judge you find is making decisions that are against the, if you like, the common law, the common rights, the common understanding of the community, that judge can actually be brought back to the people and thrown out of office. To me, this is important to consider it, that there are historical mechanisms, not necessarily within the constitutions of either of our two nations, but there are historical mechanisms. The Swiss are using it, citizens-initiated referenda recall. And that to me is something that we could actually place on the table as saying, well, there's no answer to this. Yes, there is answers to this, but it comes back to, like all things, it always comes back to the individual. It's the individual who is losing their rights. It's their individual who is being dominated by government. It's the individual who's being dominated by politically active, if you like, legal decisions. It's the individual who is suffering under this. And so in this case, if political parties don't cut the mustard, if the governments don't cut the mustard, if the courts won't cut the mustard, in the end, there's only one left standing, and that is the individual. And I believe this is the time in history where we actually need to look and concentrate on the initiative within each and every individual to actually have some influence over their life, over their political results that they actually receive. And of course, this is where we consider the difference between the collective and the individual. And I think Wally Klinck is the ideal man to pick up this baton and run with it. Wally.
Well, historically, our law had developed in a complex environment, and we had tyrants and kings who thought that they had the divine right to rule and all of that sort of thing. But we have evolved a system over time which we supposed recognized that the individual should have a maximum amount of leeway and freedom in his own life. In other words, that laws were necessary, but that they should be few and that they should be directed to the enhancement of the freedom of the individual in as much as we do have them. Because law can be used as an instrument of absolute rule. You can make up rules upon rules upon rules and layers of rules. And that all circumscribes the activities of freedom of the individual. And these laws are made by human beings. Now, we have been born into a natural environment, and the position was taken that they would try to interpret human laws in the light of what they perceived as being natural laws, without all these artificial human-devised restrictions on humanity. The Marxist view, of course, is completely atheist. They do not believe in any body of law that supervenes. They believe that they, in their wisdom and within their domain of power, which they want to maximize, that they are qualified to make regulations concerning the activities of men and women in the world. And so naturally, they do not take that freedom-oriented position toward law. They take the position that they have power, and they make their writings and ideology make no bones about the fact that power is what counts, and the only thing that can be really regarded as important. They don't want to get into any arguments about freedom and that sort of thing, abstract things. They want to administer society. And our title is The Administrative Era. And they're trying to cinch their powers over humanity in order to control their activities. And not only their activities, but their thought. And believe me, that is a very important aspect of the whole thing, because we're involved in an ideological, conceptual battle where the power is aimed at directing and controlling the individual mind to think in a prescribed manner. And that's what we really do have facing us. We have to recognize the extreme danger of that sort of thing, because with the power of finance, which controls virtually everything we do, and the media being concentric with finance and subservient, controlled by and subservient to the to finance, there's a tremendous centralized power to control the thinking of the individual. And that you can be seen in regard to this COVID thing. The media is just a constant, ceaseless, endless barrage of so-called information about it, stressing threats and dire consequences if we don't deal with it, when in fact it is little more than a cold, they say, and which incidentally for which we don't have vaccines even yet. We don't have vaccines for colds. Why do we need a vaccine for a virus which actually is far less dangerous than it's being portrayed?
Thank you.
So it's basically centralization of power through control of the mind. And with regard to that, Marxism has played a major role in generating hostility, envy, hatred, because it is taught that anyone who does anything constructive to add something of worthwhile to this life, and who is successful enough in doing so, that he has been rewarded for it, is some kind of an exploiter of the underdog. And that is a rather presumptuous assumption. Quite unfair and unreasonable.
Yep. I noted in the work, the study that I've been doing of the, if you like, the indoctrination, the brainwashing of prisoners of war. Korean War done by the Chinese Communists, but the Chinese Communists were actually resourced and trained by the Bolsheviks. And Pavlov, of course, being the parent psychologist, if you like, of how to manipulate people. And a big part of that brainwashing was guilt, was actually placing guilt before people, that how selfish could they be? Why don't they become part of the group? Why do they have to stand out? Now, the thing is, in that observation by that major, it was an American major who actually surveyed the prisoners of war coming back and how many were brainwashed and how many weren't. And of those that were not brainwashed, he was able to say that what they did was they had a deep love and affection and affinity with their family. They had family. That's the first thing. They were able to place vivid memories of love and comfort and society, if you like, kinship. And also that those individuals also had a deep sense of religion. They generally had a Christian background, and it was that faith that during times of adversity that they were able to overcome the, if you like, the brainwashing, the torture in those prisoner of war camps. And it wasn't physical necessarily, it was intellectual, it was spiritual. And at times in that book it was that prisoners would just give up. They would give up. They would one day not get out of bed. They would just stay in bed because this was all too hard. They no longer had a desire to live. And sure enough, 1 or 2 days after, they would die. They would just give up completely and die. And yet the opposite of it, of course, is the person who has family, who has kinship, who has love, loyalty, affection. These are the very things that can overcome totalitarianism. They're the things that actually bring societies together. Mutual love and cooperation. So very important. It's a fundamental fact of life, if you like. It's a natural law. Your thoughts, please, Robert Klinck.
I think what you say is very applicable to what's happening right now, Arnie, because it seems as if the measures that are being imposed to contend with COVID are designed to break down your loving relations with neighbors and even family. In some of the things that are being proposed are that you're going to have to wear a mask in your own home. Well, this is alienating. It's some, you can't even see the face of your relatives, and it's bad enough not being able to see the face of anybody outside. But that has a psychological effect, and the effect is to alienate you from other people, as does social distancing. So I really think that these measures have been calculated by expert psychologists, and they're intended to break the cohesion of society. You know, the basis of cohesion is in the family and among neighbors and friends. You're not allowed to associate with your neighbors when they clamp down with these regulations. You're not allowed to go outside. And another very potent technique for breaking people down psychologically is isolation. And the Russians perfected this. They would keep people in a cell, if it was a perfectly white cell, and they kept them in there, not speaking to anybody for 3 weeks. Apparently, virtually anybody would go insane, because we're not meant to have experience that kind of isolation. But isolation is exactly what all these COVID measures is intended to impose upon us. So it strikes me that we should be very suspicious of the whole exercise. The measures obviously don't make sense in many respects. They're imposed with no discretion, no making special cases even. It's just imposed, and you will obey, and the effect is that people are sort of retreating within themselves, I think. And this is most unhealthy. I think it's not only unhealthy psychologically, it's also unhealthy physically, probably. So we might have an upsurge of all kinds of health problems if this approach to dealing with this so-called pandemic is not changed. But certainly these methods of altering people's spiritual strength have been known for a long time. And as you say, Arnie, they're not as successful with some as with others. If you have just a strong underlying spiritual strength, you'll be able to resist all kinds of abuse and tortures. But for somebody who is not like that, who is more free-floating spiritually, they can't stand up so long because they don't have a grounding to which they can appeal. So, I think that's a very interesting aspect of what is being imposed on the world right now. And I would also like to say that I endorse fully your suggestion that we should have recall capacity. And I think probably we should have recall ability for bureaucrats, for politicians, for judges, for anybody whom the community believes is getting completely out of line with the will of the population in any respect. That's an excellent suggestion. That should be incorporated in law, if not in the Constitution. A very good idea.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Robert. I was considering the other day the situation in Victoria with the lockdown, and it's interesting because there's lots of thoughts that I have, but one of the things that I did note, and just to add a bit of lightness to today, I'm going to illustrate here. Picture here is of a good neighbour fence, and I saw one in regard to the COVID lockdown, and what they had done in this area of the between the neighbours was they had actually hinged two panels, one to fold down towards one neighbour and the other to fold down towards the other neighbour. And what it did was it guaranteed social distancing. And the image that I saw was that both had a glass of beer in their hand and they were having a chat. And I thought, good on them. Where there's the need, people will find a way. And that to me was the beauty of it. Okay, abide by the law. I've got to stay in my home. All right, here I am. I'm in my home. And there's my neighbour, and I can have a beer and I can have a chat with him. And to me, that's a beautiful way of, if you like, deconstructing the narrative. The idea of holding recall, of holding to account, I think these are very, very important concepts. But the first, of course, is to understand what is the agreement? What is the agreement about? And of course, we call the agreement our constitution. If you play cricket or baseball or whatever, gridiron, you play a sport, there is an agreement, there is a set of rules, and that's what the umpire is there for. And the thing is, in our, if you like, our national set of rules, or in our province or our state set of rules, there is a relationship between the three levels of government, at least in Australia, the three levels within each realm of the state or the Commonwealth. And it is the lower house, the upper house, and in Australia it is the monarch's representative, the Queen's representative. We call it the governor for the state or the governor-general for the Commonwealth. And so there are three levels. Now, it's very important to note, take into account, those three levels are independent, separate, and they should be sovereign levels of power. In other words, one level can't dominate the other two. And what we're seeing is, and especially with the Reform Act, I think it's called 2003 in Victoria, what that act did was it essentially emasculated two levels of the government in favour of the parliament, in favour of the one level. So the Legislative Assembly could dominate, and then when it goes through the council, they could only ever reject supply bill 3 times, read 3 times, and then automatically it had to proceed. And then finally, the governor, who up till 2003 could actually withhold assent, up till 2003, after 2003, the governor had to do as directed by the Premier. So in other words, that third level of government was emasculated as well as the second. This is how we've watched the progressive dictatorship in the state of Victoria evolve. It's been a long-term strategy. The Constitution Act 1975, the Reform, I think it's Reform Constitution Act 2003, 17 years ago, 45 years ago. This has been a long-term plan, a strategy to deconstruct the state of Victoria and the nation of Australia. High Court judges, Supreme Court judges are not beyond making political decisions. It's something that we actually recognise. But in the end, what is left for us as individuals in community, what is left for us as individuals in community to actually restore order, to bring power, to decentralise power, move it away from the monopoly, the tyranny, the totalitarian power, and bring levels of power back to the individual so that government is there to serve and not to dictate. And it's certainly a difference between, if you like, what you would consider a Christian nation and a totalitarian nation. Entirely two different things. Your thoughts, please, Wallace Klinck.
Well, people get into politics are frequently opportunists who are trying to simply seize an opportunity for their own material and psychological advancement. And we have to have mechanisms where we can protect ourselves from that particular type of oppressive or domineering personality. But we have to have a line of responsibility. I mean, we should have the option to deal with the people who are appointed to direct affairs. But the people who actually carry them out is another thing. The idea of recall is not perfect. I mean, they did that in Alberta, but of course, promptly the opposition brought the recall process into operation in order to get rid of the elected government, and the government quite promptly dropped the legislation, I understand, because they saw it as a threat to themselves. But the ultimate power has to be with the individual, and the individual does not have appropriate power if he is impoverished or if he is if he is oppressed in some way that suppresses his ability to express his will with respect to policy. And of course, the financial system comes back, and the financial system is really the core of all this problem, because let's face it, the people who are protesting, I've been to the States, and I have been to some pretty depressing areas. It was to do with social cause, but to do with social psychology and so on. I wasn't personally involved in it, but I had been invited to accompany the person who was, and we saw some really pathetic cases of poverty. My goodness, people sitting on steps, hollow-eyed people who had no hope and just nothing. Their lives were a blank, and I don't think they even had sufficient awareness to be hostile. And then we went to see a lady who had lost her husband. She said she had a good life until he died. And then she was a lovely person in a way, I think, really a good person. She would laugh, and then she would cry. She was in a state of emotional instability. And there's very serious poverty in the United States. It's not an example of a perfect polity, that's for sure. And but the problem is the Marxists have given the financial system has caused this, while they blame the problems, the Marxists do, on the greed of the capitalist or anyone who does anything constructive to actually improve society. And so they want to destroy the people who are actually the source of improvements. And they themselves are more ideologues than they are experts. And when they do get in power, they try to govern, to shape policy according to ideology rather than to genuine consumer desires or demands. They do it according to abstract conceptions of justice. And what they do is they penalize the people who are most creative, and they simply run the society down. And this is not theory, this is fact. That's exactly what they've done. So China has made some big strides technologically, but again, it was Western seed money and ideas that acted as a seed for that. And they have retained some oppressive state centralized power policies rather than trying to emancipate the individual. The individual is expected to conform to certain state prescribed ideology. Same thing with their so-called system of rewards and punishments. They say that it's to upgrade the consciousness of the people in terms of right thinking. But the thing of it is, the right thinking comes from the state. It doesn't come from the people, and it doesn't come from God. It comes from those who control the state. So it's likely to turn out badly. You see, the powers that be are in a bind now, too. I think they were feeling that they were losing control, actually, because of the rather unusual, unexpected amount of communication amongst individuals because of the internet and so on. And they didn't want to lose control of the initiative of setting the rules for society. So then in desperation, I think they have moved rapidly to try and create crises and the basis from which to generate decrees and so on, which control the people, which goes completely against the Marxist idea. It's supposed to be something that's democratic. But it simply lapses into state tyranny. It's all centralized in policy and administration, and that removes freedom from the people. And Marx felt that the injustice arose from the entrepreneurs, the people who did it, create creative businesses and so on, because of their inevitable nature in exploiting the workers in such a way as to steal the value of their labor. And that assumes that labor is the sole source of value, which is completely wrong today, because any kind of an objective assessment of the situation determines very quickly that production today is primarily due to non-labor factors in terms of knowledge inherited from the past and tools and so on that we have developed and which we have inherited. Now, the idea is either we're going to create a situation where all wealth comes from labor, and therefore the proletariat or the laboring class has to be in a controlling position, and not only that, but in a favored position, and that the so-called bourgeoisie, middle classes, the business classes, should essentially be wiped out, destroyed. Now, if you destroy the creative elements within your society, I don't think it should take too much imagination to understand quite clearly the detrimental and fatal effect that that is going to have.
Yeah.
The problem is not that workers should be guaranteed jobs and that their remuneration should be set by the state. The problem is that the results of enterprise do not flow freely to the community because of the financial system. The system does not generate sufficient consumer income for the population at large to take advantage of the developments and technology and so on, which has so much increased our potential for physical wealth and for freedom, because we are released, or should be released, by these things enormously from the necessity of going to work every day and either slaving away or sitting at some desk scribbling on paper about things which are essentially irrelevant, but just so that we can earn a living, that we can gain money. You see, no one can claim that they have full access to the inheritance of the cultural heritage. That is something that came from the past. You can't say that only this class of people or this segment of society has a right to this benefit. It belongs to society as a whole. And social credit, of course, provides the means of allowing that to flow freely from the end point of production to the community at large, without any direction, without any dictatorial decrees or means or force, whatever. It just flows. And that is where the present system is such a violation of natural law. It freezes the economy at the very end, which is most essential and for which the economy exists, and that's distribution, consumption. And that's where the problem is, where it causes the enormous hardships which exist in that part of society which is being dispossessed by the very forces that should be their emancipation. And so therefore, those with an axe to grind, and they have legitimate complaints. I would never say that they don't. They have a terrible solution, which is no solution. But this is the way that discontent, hardship, discontent, misery has been, it's been placed upon segments of society and has generated, a very, very negative and destructive reaction. So you either get over this idea that all wealth is created by labor, and therefore labor is entitled to all consideration in this dispensation, or you recognize that the efforts of the past, the developments of the past, have come to us as inheritance, and it's something that we're all entitled to, quite aside from the whole productive system of the day. These things have come to us as an inheritance, and they should be allowed to develop and flow freely. When you have a physical process and you apply energy to materials, and you do something to frustrate, to block the results which you expect should flow from that type of process, you're constipating, you're making a costive situation, you're freezing the end result from moving toward its desired end. And this has just endless repercussions in human misery, suffering, and unrest. So we have to understand that the Marxist approach is not realistic. It's not realistic in another way, is that amateurs or untrained people are not going to give you the best results. You need people who have devoted a good deal of their lives and their efforts to becoming experts in certain things. And you have to allow the experts to exist and to bring forth the abundance they're capable of bringing forth. If you don't, you're not going to get it. And so Marxism destroys, and it's been demonstrated time and time again, it destroys efficiency, and it destroys functionality on the basis not of practical matters, but of pure ideology, pure abstract thoughts, which have no no actual relationship to the real world.
Yeah.
And if you're going to do that, well, you're going to have nothing but chaos.
And that's exactly what we're experiencing, Wallace. We
Exactly.
are experiencing chaos. We're experiencing it in our political environment, certainly in our economic environment. And it's just transferring across that the security, if you like, the enjoyment of life is being sapped out of it. And this is what we're experiencing. We are experiencing a totalitarian imposition on us. This is what Marxism is about. The closer we head towards Marxism, the more, if you like, isolated and deprived we are as individuals. And yet, in actual fact, given the opportunity of expression, the function of government is to provide the right environment. It's like the road rules. It doesn't tell you where to go. As long as you abide by the rules, you're free to travel wherever you like. And that's the function of government. It's to uphold the law, not impose and impoverish the nation through law. And that's what we're experiencing. We're experiencing all of that. Your thoughts and closing comments, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, the Constitution is the underlying laws of the society. And these are not something that should be changing all the time. Once you sort them out and you get them working in a beneficial way, and people have a consensus that they're valuable and good and sound, then they shouldn't be subject to change all the time. And actually, we're very fortunate in having constitutional principles that extend back hundreds and hundreds of years, because it's given us kind of a stability. Poor old France has a new revolution every 20 years, and they're always changing their constitution. I'm sure that people in France are wondering now when the next constitution is going to be promulgated, because it's been, I think it's 5 times now since the French Revolution that they've come up with a new constitution and a new approach to the government. So we are fortunate in having stability, but we have this idea now that we should have politicians who are constantly producing new laws. Well, if that's the case, surely this is a condemnation of what has gone before. And the fact is that we have had very sound principles incorporated in our Constitution, and there is no reason to tamper with them. Now, there should be, I suppose, a possibility of passing legislation that accommodates new forms of technology and so on. But the idea that we should have all these members of parliament sitting for 200 days a year or whatever and generating as many laws as they can, because if they can come up with a law, they're going to enhance their reputation, is a kind of lunacy. It's an attack on our heritage. So that's a very bad thing. I noticed in the United States recently that there's a fellow, I think his name is Steve Posobiec or something like that. Anyway, he's quite an academic. He's got all kinds of degrees, and he's been regarded as an authority by people sort of, I guess, what you call the right side of politics down there. But he was interviewed by Alex Jones last week, I believe. And I saw this interview. It was astonishing. He said, the American Constitution is useless. It's outdated. We should just abandon it. And he said, right now, we have an opportunity to have a strong leader, because Donald Trump is a man who is capable of leading in an affirmative, decisive way. He says we should re-elect him for another 4 years. And he went on to say, we'll never find another leader of this caliber with this strength. So the next leader will automatically cause power to revert to the population. And this is the kind of insanity that is being promulgated these days. Can you imagine? Just abandon the Constitution on the authority of some academic and hand all power over to essentially a dictator. It seems to be what's happening everywhere anyway, but we should be resisting that with all our strength, because it bodes very ill for the future if we're going to all be under arbitrary government. So that is something that we should consider. And also, I think we should realize that that monetary considerations impinge very greatly on our society. They do in, for example, the courts in the United States. I believe that 98% of the trials in the United States are settled on the basis of plea bargaining. Well, they're supposed to be trial by jury in our tradition. And if you settle your case on the basis of plea bargaining, which means the prosecution will say, we'll send you to jail for 20 years, but if you plead guilty, we'll make it only 5 years. This circumvents all the principles that we valued so much from the past of giving people a chance to have their case evaluated by their peers. So this is because there just isn't the finance available to prosecute all these cases the way they should be. Now, in the first place, there are many, probably the majority of cases are the result of financial pressures that are on people in the first place. They go into thievery, they abuse their spouses because they're under financial pressure. If that financial pressure was lifted, was reduced in the way that my brother Wallace just said, then the need for prosecution would vastly diminish. But we have to recognize that the financial system is, because of its failure to sustain the population through adequate provision of purchasing power, is having adverse effects in every area. And if we want society to improve and dispense with the elected officials producing a plethora of laws that interfere in our lives increasingly, we have to repair this financial system that is gnawing at the innards of our society.
Thank you for that, Robert. There's a couple of thoughts that came to mind. One is the great issue of 1215, of course, was proclamation by the king, decrees and proclamations, and of course the barons and the church resisted, and they overcame that tyranny by forcing the seal that John would abide by it. And it's interesting because that signing 1215 didn't even last a month before it was actually overruled by external influences, and then it had to be re-signed again and finally written into the law for 1295. 1295 wrote the Magna Carta into the law, the common law. The other example of proclamation by decree is Henry VIII. The big issue that Henry had was that the church would actually hold him to account based on a law over and above him. And that, of course, is natural law or divine law. Natural law, the nature of things, how they actually work. Henry, as a monarch, wanted to be a supreme monarch. And so this was the issue of that day. Now, taking into account these, if you like, relatively modern, within the last 1,000 years, examples, last century, 4 major dictatorships. We started off with the establishment of the Soviet Union, the Russian Revolution, and the dictatorship in that nation. Then we had Italy and Germany, Second World War. And then, of course, in the 50s, again, China. Right, these were the major countries, if you like. There were other dictatorships as well, but not to the same degree of circumstance that was so dominant over, if you like, the whole world, the outworking of their dictatorships. We've seen dictatorships. None of them ended up pretty. There was always carnage, and there was always, of course, proclamation by decree, arbitrary law. Now, you mentioned, Robert, the 200 days a year of sitting with the Parliament. I'd love them to sit for the 200 days a year. In Victoria, it's lucky if they've sat for 2 days in the last 6 months. It's been ruled by proclamation, ruled by decree. This is a dictatorship. What is needed now is that Parliament should hold the executive accountable, and that's not going on. There are two functions. The High Court of Britain determined there are two principal functions of every representative. The first is to represent the electorate in the Parliament. That's the primary function, to represent the electorate in the Parliament, not the party, not the political machine that's backing them, the electorate, the people in their community. And the second function is to hold the executive accountable. Two functions, the executive being, if you like, the ministers, the bureaucrats, and the Premier or Prime Minister, to hold that leadership to account in the Parliament. They were the two functions of a politician, of a representative. And both have failed in Victoria. Both have failed. Now, I don't believe there's one representative in Victoria who has done their two principal functions in the last 6 months. And so the Victorians have to look seriously at it. This thing ruled by decree, we're seeing what it's like. This is experiencing it. This is Henry VIII. This is King John. This is Italy, Germany, Russia, China. This is what it's like. We're experiencing the difference between, if you like, the freedom of the individual and totalitarianism. You can call it social credit and you can call it socialism. The individual and the collective. That's what we're experiencing. And based on that, make up your mind. Is this really what you want? Is this what you want for your children and your grandchildren? Is this the legacy that was handed to you from past generations in the form of common law, trial by jury, habeas corpus, Magna Carta, the Constitution limiting the power of government? Your thoughts and closing comments, please, Wallace Klinck.
Well, I think you summarized that very nicely, Arnie. It's a philosophical position, but it's one that's grounded in, we believe, reality. That we did not create ourselves, and I think that we must recognize that our very nature stems from something prior to the human being, and so that therefore we cannot just simply assume that we are qualified to establish what is natural law. We're a product within natural law. We're not the originators of it, and we can't decree how other people should live on the basis of our arbitrary interpretation of how it should be. We should be able to live in harmony. We should be able to live functionally and beneficially without too much fuss and bother. There's far too much completely unnecessary argument and legalism and resort to the courts, friction. As Bob said, I mean, the courts are overburdened because they have so much they're trying to answer to, because of the fundamental unsoundness of the economic system, primarily under the existing financial system, which literally claims, if you think about it, that it owns the earth. And I just heard, I don't know if it's substantiated or not, but that one individual in Britain, and I think in the States, I'm not sure, I think it was in the States, have actually had their accounts canceled at their banks with the blatant justification that their ideology does not conform with the bank. Now that shows you the ultimate terrible, terrible power that finance holds over not only governments, but the individual, him or herself. And this person is alleged to have suffered financially very badly over this divestiture, or whatever you call it. I mean, but it is. It's just they're using the power of an instrument that controls all human interaction to control not only the freely chosen actions of individuals in association, but the actual ideas or beliefs of individuals and their right to express them. Now, that's a terrible power. I mean, it's probably the ultimate tyranny. So, and, you know, one of the prominent Australian businessmen, I think he was associated with one of the airlines, I think, some time ago, made the statement that if people don't agree with us, they won't fly. They won't fly. They won't bank. What an incredible, arrogant presumption of power. And so I think that, unfortunately, that's what we're facing, and we're going to have to deal with it.
Mm. Thank you for that.
And then you remember that Jesus, who is supposed to be the basis of Western philosophy or culture, government, he didn't just sit around and say, it's too bad these bankers are so bad. He went into the, amongst the money changers and is alleged to have literally driven them out of the temple. So I don't think we should feel at all hesitant about voicing our concerns about this dreadful financial system and demanding the appropriate changes whereby individuals are freed rather than enslaved by the financial instrument.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Wally. That's beautifully put. Yes, he cast them out. He cast them out of the temple, and I think that's a profound thing. When I read, just as an aside, when I do read my Bible and the Synoptic Gospels, it's what Christ did and what he said. The ramifications and the reverberations are felt thousands of years afterwards, and the profound truths of those. And when I use a word like, or a descriptor like the natural law, it is the nature of the human being to want to do these things, to want to be free, to want to tend their own garden, to go outside, to enjoy the sunshine, to go to the beach, to walk where they choose to walk or drive where they choose to drive. It is not the function, it is not the natural purpose of government to dominate and to arbitrate in the sense of proclaim or decree, you shall or you shan't, to issue laws and decrees. This is something. This is an outworking of someone who is honestly, they're delusional. They're delusional. They're thinking that their thinking is good enough for the whole nation, and of course that is absurd. That is absolutely absurd. It's impertinent. It's been a very good forum today, gentlemen. Thank you so much for it. The Administrative Era Series 4. Arnis Luks at the Crossroads. Thanks, Wally. Thanks, Robert.
Thank you, Arnie. It's good to review these things.
No worries. Cheers.